I'm Christian Nelson. I'm a forester at Fond du Lac. I've been a forester here for about 13 and a half years or so. And today I'm going to tell you about a timber sale, the Fond du Lac Creek timber sale that is proposed. The presentation should be specific enough that you understand what the sale is about, but also general enough that the same type of concepts can apply to most of the timber sales that we set up, and some of the facts are applicable to the reservation's forestry resources in general. So today I'm going to talk about, essentially in order, the where, what, why, and how of this timber sale. So first of all, I'll explain where it is. The proposed timber sale you can see on this slide is the red outline with the yellow cross hatching. It is about a half mile or so northwest of the tribal center. Access is either off of Breviter Road, which you can do easily enough on foot by walking through the backyard of the new cultural center, or you can also access it. There's a trail system that comes off Jarvie Drive from Whitetail Drive. So nearby the timber sale area is in the pink outline. North of the proposed timber sale area is all forested lands owned by Fond du Lac. There's a lot of red maple and sugar maple present amongst these stands. There are also aspen stands and birch is mixed in, as well as basswood and yellow birch and things like that. And then we'll talk about it later, but the little parcel that you see, the sort of blue rectangle east of the timber sale area, that is a county parcel. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's important to know that around the proposed timber sale area is slightly younger forest. It's about 40 to 55 years old, and the average diameter is about 8 to 9 inches or so. It's about maybe the size of a dinner plate or a little smaller. So what's actually in the timber sale area, that was that red outlined area on the previous map. It's about 40% aspen. There's two types of aspen there, quaking aspen, sometimes called trembling aspen, and big-tooth aspen. It's about 30% paper birch, 20% red maple, and then the rest of the timber sale is basically a mix of basswood, red oak, ash, and sugar maple. The average size of most of the mature trees out there is about 10 inches in diameter. That's getting closer to a dinner plate size. And these trees are old, especially for the species. I'll talk about that later, but they're 80 to 90 years old. And there are few seedlings of any tree species, which has got some important consequences if you're looking to the future of this stand. I'll talk about that later as well. So the trees that are actually within the timber sale area are very old. It's pretty much that fact which helped us start thinking about doing something with this stand, and I'll show you why that's important in a moment. The aspen, birch, and red maple, just due to their general biology, generally start to die off around 70 to 80 years old. They live longer on better sites with better soils or better water, and they live usually shorter a time on harsher sites, nutrient poor, drier soil, more prone to droughts, things like that. But on average, aspen, birch, and red maple live to be about 70 to 80 and then rapidly decline. And you can see that. We'll see some pictures in a moment. There's a lot of dead tops and dead branches, especially in the aspen and the paper birch, but you're starting to see a lot of that in the red maple now too. And then maple, the red maple out there, especially in the sugar maple, there's not a lot of that, but the red maple that's out there really has a lot of frost cracks and fungal cankers. And if you don't know what those are, stick around for a second and we'll see some pictures. So you see a lot of this walking around that area. To the left is a red maple. It's a little hard to tell, but there's a dead main branch, no leaves left, no living branches on it, and the rest of the tree is basically starting to follow suit. Usually a tree starts to decline from the top down when it's just sort of dying of old age. And you can see the paper birch on the right. There's a number of dead trees just in this one picture. I think I can see 4 or 5 large dead paper birch. You can see some of these have died quite some time ago. They don't have any branches left at all. This is a picture of some maples, and so on the left, believe it or not, that tree was actually still alive, just barely, but it's completely covered in mushroom conchs, the fruiting bodies that you can see. And then on the right, you see an awful lot of that too, basically trees that are hollow, They're not going to live long. They would be hard to tap for any sort of sap because there's basically just not a lot of solid material to actually get a spile into and expect decent sap flow. And especially with trees like these. So all these pictures that you see were taken out on the site. This is actually pretty typical of the red maples that you see out here. Especially on the south side where you get sun scald, you get in the winter where the sun bounces off the snow and basically sort of bakes the south side of that tree. And then if it has any sort of rot issues or anything like that, that freezing and thawing that can occur can really expand and contract the water that's sort of in that rotted area, and you end up with basically hollow trees. And you can imagine a tree like this is not only hard to tap, but it's not going to take much of a summer windstorm, and we've had quite a few of those in the last few years, to basically just snap a tree like this off. So again, these are pictures actually taken out on the site. This, especially the upper left and the bottom right picture, essentially what you have is you have the overstory trees growing old and dying. You can see on the picture to the left, you can see a dead tree in the foreground. And you can maybe make out sort of a dying tree in the upper right corner of that same picture. And there's really no trees actually replacing the overstory trees. It's so thick with hazel brush, and I'll talk about it in a second, but deer browse is another huge problem out there. So that if you do have trees that are coming in as seedlings, they're basically getting chewed up by either deer, most likely, or snowshoe hare. And what you are left with is basically just brush. And that's kind of the future of this stand if we don't interact. So here's a slide of probably deer browse. On the left, you can see most of the twigs. You can kind of see the red buds on the maples. There's one in the two top ones, I guess you can kind of make out the sort of triangle-shaped red bud that is still attached. And especially on the picture on the right, you can see there's a red bud on that lower branch going off to the left and the right, but the top's gone, and deer basically browse those off. What happens then is that that tree, if it lives, those side branches that aren't browsed become the new dominant branches, unless they get browsed again. And what can happen is over and over and over again, deer will hit these every winter, and they keep knocking them back, so they're never taller than 2 or 3 feet, and they just never get out of the reach of deer, essentially, and they sort of become these short, stunted bonsai trees before they essentially grow old. It takes energy to keep regrowing branches, twigs, buds, and the tree eventually just sort of peters out essentially and dies, and it never actually becomes a full tree. So the seedling and a lot of the seedlings out on the site are in the same boat where they're just not doing well, and they're not going to replace the trees that are dying. And if you kind of think of maybe a family where the adults are getting old and you don't have children, well then that whole family is going to die out. It's a little bit like that on this site where you have these adult trees are getting very old, and there's just not a lot of children that are basically living to replace them. They're really getting hammered by a number of factors, especially deer. Another thing that's going on out on this site is some of these trees have grown back from stump sprouts. They might have cut at some point in time and stump sprouted, or they might have snapped off in a storm and stump sprouted, or perhaps there's a fire, probably not on this particular site, but it can happen on some sites. And what you end up with basically is a whole lot of small twigs coming out of one stump. And as those grow up, some will die, but a lot will live. But this is what an 80-year-old tree looks like out there, where basically nothing is large enough to tap. You have 6 or 8 stems, essentially trees coming out of one stump, and they're all vying for sunlight and for water and for soil nutrients, and none of them alone can get very large, and they get crowded. They have small crowns, and these would make very poor trees to tap even if they were large enough. You just wouldn't expect a lot of sap, and you wouldn't expect very sweet sap out of these types of trees. It's a little bit like an unthinned carrot patch. If you're a gardener, then you kind of know that you throw down a bunch of seeds in the spring and you get all these little seedlings coming up, and if you don't thin them, if you think, oh, I want all the carrots, I don't want to pull any, what you end up with is basically a whole lot of not very useful carrots. And so it's a little bit like on the previous slide where you essentially have just a bunch of crowded trees, but they're not very useful, especially if you have a specific intent in mind, such as tapping them for sap. So what do I think this stand will look like in 20 years if nothing is done? There's not going to be a whole lot of remaining aspen, birch, basswood, or red maple out there. In 20 years, these things are going to be 100 to 110 years old, and they simply don't live that long. So they'll be dying out, and as we saw in previous slides, there's not a lot of seedlings and saplings there to replace them, but there's abundant hazel brush. And so I think what you'll end up with basically is a lot of brush. And some of the red oak, which lives a little bit longer than aspen, birch, and red maple out there, and the sugar maple will probably be holding on. But they're not very abundant out there. And if they're not successfully reproducing because deer are browsing the seedlings out there, then they're not going to be a very good replacement suite of species either for the overstory. So one of the things that brought this sale to the public's attention basically was people knew that they had tapped trees for maple syrup behind the cultural center area, fortunately. And so what I found was that so the blue outline parcel here is actually a county-owned parcel. It's about 10 acres. And there's ample evidence that people have tapped out here, and I think this is the area where people thought the timber sale might be overlapping. I didn't actually see, and I looked, I did not see any evidence that the trees that are within the timber sale area have been tapped, except for maybe where people didn't quite know where that western boundary is of that county parcel and might have accidentally gone on the Fond du Lac property, probably unintentionally. But other than just a few trees west of this 10-acre county parcel, I didn't see any trees tapped within the timber sale area. And as you saw in some of those pictures, there's actually not a lot of good choices out there either right now. So this is what it looks like. It's pretty easy to see. This was on that county parcel. You can definitely see an old file site from a year or maybe even a few years ago. A lot of the trees on that county parcel have been tapped multiple times. So there's ample resources where people could be tapping. This map, you can see it's littered with little orange polygons, little orange shapes. It's showing basically where the forest cover type is primarily sugar maple. So we have about 137 sugar maple stands totaling about 3,000 acres. That's within Fond du Lac ownership, within the reservation boundaries. Not shown on this map, about 1,000 more acres of red maple stands. And the other thing that this map does not show is small diameter stands. This is only showing 8-inch diameter stands or larger. So basically stands that are almost ready to be or are certainly ready to be tapped or could be tapped. And also not shown on this map is all the many thousands of acres more of aspen and paper birch dominated stands that have a big component of generally red maple, sometimes sugar maple. So really there's thousands and thousands of acres of currently tappable stands within the reservation. So a lot of people say in timber sales in general, forestry in general, why not let nature take its course? And probably the biggest reason against having nature just take its course, which certainly sounds good, is that nature no longer really functions in the same way that it would have 100 plus years ago. One of the biggest missing components is fire. There was a lot of light surface fires that were probably intentionally set, and they were used to clear brush, small trees, prepare a seed bed. That was some of the effects, whether or not that was the original intention of the surface fire. Maybe it was just to clear brush, make travel easier, make hunting easier, or maybe it was just to get new, fresh vegetation that would be good browse for game species. Maybe it was elk way back in the day, or woodland caribou, or more recently white-tailed deer. But very large fires would also occasionally burn, or big wind events that would basically knock whole stands down or burn whole stands up, either burning up the trees, uprooting them, snapping them. A lot of the fires were intentionally set. We don't have a lot of lightning start fires in Minnesota because typically whenever we get lightning, we also get a lot of rain. That's not true in places like the Southwest United States, where you get a lot of dry lightning. So lightning out there can really start a lot of fires. Here, most of our fires were intentionally set. And we've got some pretty good records, and there's some active research going on to make that even better, looking at essentially how often fires were set and why they were set, if that's known, and what its effects were. The other big thing that's impeding the let nature take its course philosophy is basically we have a really high population of deer, much higher than it was historically, certainly higher than it was 100 years ago. And those deer and also snowshoe hare are big browsers, big eaters, basically mowing their way through our forests and through our fields. And some of the biggest impacts in forestry that we see, of course, is that a lot of our seedlings are basically eaten before they can get a chance to be saplings and then larger trees. If you were more of a botanist type person, or you're looking at medicinal plants or something like that, then deer can really hammer those too. They have sort of their favorite things they like to eat in the summer and their favorite things they like to eat in the winter. And they really change and alter what vegetation looks like, and basically what wins and what loses essentially is what is and what isn't tasty to a white-tailed deer these days. So there's things that we can do to help mitigate these problems, and to essentially, if we can't let nature take its course because we don't have large wildfires that we can just let burn, or we can't intentionally prescribe burn enough acres just due to logistics, money, time, narrow windows in the spring and fall to really pull these burns off. Then there's other things that we can do to sort of help get nature a little more in line with maybe where it used to be, even if some of the processes don't quite work the same these days. A lot of why let nature take its course also won't work, especially on these stands, is simple tree biology. Aspen, paper birch, red maple, these species need full sunlight to grow. They don't grow in the shade of other trees, and that's why you don't often go into, say, a paper birch stand and see young paper birch coming underneath the overstory paper birch. You only see that when you really start to see big holes and some of these big pockets of dying trees now provide enough sunlight so that some of these other sun-loving species can grow. Some of the species out there on this particular site that don't necessarily need full sunlight to grow would be sugar maple, which can grow pretty well in the shade. Red oak can grow in the shade for a few years. You can kind of get established, but if it doesn't receive full sunlight in a little while, it will definitely decline and die out. And basswood's kind of in that same boat where for a couple years it can grow in the shade pretty comfortably, but after maybe 5-10 years, if it's not getting more sunlight than that, then you'll start to see species like that start to die out too. Forests don't just turn into what you want, you need to tend them. And a lot of people think if you would just take your hands off, sort of turn your back to the stand, it would just sort of turn into what you want. Like nature would just sort of direct the stand into something that would suit you. And if you don't have any intentions or any objectives for what you'd like to see that stand used for, if you don't have any specific purpose in mind, then that's probably true. You don't need to tend them. But if you were looking to cultivate, say, a better sugar bush or a better paper birch stand, or if you wanted to see certain species that maybe used to be here historically but aren't abundant now, white pine comes to mind, that's just not going to happen. You have to go in and you have to intentionally, purposefully, and strategically plan what you want and determine how you're going to implement those plans and achieve your goals, what kind of follow-up work you need to do. to basically get the forest looking like you would like. And then there's other things that aren't quite functioning like nature maybe did 100 or 200 or 500 years ago. Things like climate change. There's insects and disease, both native but also invasive non-native insects and disease species. So that our native species are behaving differently now than they used to with climate change. And also there's invasive species that are relatively new threats that need specific action. A lot of people have, I'm sure, heard of emerald ash borer that is really hammering all ash species across the United States and into Canada. There's also something called the Asian longhorn beetle, which is currently out east. Massachusetts, I think, was the last I heard, is where it was. And fortunately, knock on wood, so to speak, it has not come this way, but this is a major killer of maple trees. Again, we do not have that here now, and hopefully it stays that way, but these are things that we have to be aware of and look for and be vigilant about and keep up to date on the latest science so that we know to recognize it and how to deal with it, if there's a way to deal with it when it comes here, if it comes here. So why would we want to have a timber sale? How is a timber sale better than letting nature take its course, or is there maybe a better way of achieving the objectives for this particular site? So one of the things that timber sales strive to do, and I should definitely emphasize that a timber sale and logging are not the same thing. I mean, there's obviously overlap, but forestry and logging are not the same thing. Forestry is really looking to the long-term future. It's looking at the bigger picture. It's looking at all the different threats that I've mentioned. And logging is basically just the process of removing trees. And the big logging era that occurred in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that was not forestry. That was straight up logging. That was not done and initiated and planned by foresters who had a long-term vision. The late 1800s and early 1900s logging era in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, the Lake States in general, those were done by lumber barons who were essentially trying to make as much money as quickly as they could. That's really different than what a forester does, which is a much longer term viewpoint, and it factors in a lot more things. It's looking for sustainability, and I'll talk more about that near the end of this presentation. So this particular timber sale, some of the objectives that we have would be to mimic the effects of natural or intentionally set wildfires. So something that would clear that brush out, maybe make a better seed bed, provide more sunlight for the species that are out there, some of the species that we want. For example, we would like to renew the aspen, birch, and maple out there, and that'll occur through root suckering. When you cut aspen, aspen grows back not just from the stump, but also from all the root systems, so it grows back very prolifically. Birch will grow back from stump sprouts, as will red maple, and both will also grow back from seed, providing that they get enough sunlight. And again, especially with the aspen and the birch, they won't grow in the shade of other trees. Another thing we can do with a timber sale is increase the diversity on the site. So I mentioned that it's 40% aspen and 30% birch and 20% red maple, and then kind of 10% of several other things. Through our timber sale, both what we choose to cut and how we choose to cut it, and also what we do afterwards, we can really increase the list of species that are out there. We can increase the list of desirable species out there. We can look at the bigger context of what's growing at Fond du Lac and intentionally plant species that are relatively rare. We can intentionally plant species that maybe used to be abundant, but now are relatively rare. So there's a number of reasons why having a timber sale would actually increase the diversity on the site, not decrease it. And through post-timber sale tending, which I'll talk about later, we can do things to enhance the growth and the survival of our desired tree species. So we can do things like stump sprout thinning or clearing aspen away from more desired trees. I'll talk about that, including with a picture that might help sort of show what that means in a second. So specifically, this timber sale is part of two different allotments. Both are majority band ownership. The band actually approved of this timber sale way back in 2007. We've contacted all the allottees at the time, and they were aware of the sale, and they were given the option of whether or not they'd like to see it cut. And we got majority interest in both allotments to say, yes, we would like some management done. The total harvest area, if you remember on that map, was about 54 acres. There's some areas within the timber sale boundary that won't be touched. There's 2 little spruce bogs, and we won't cut any of the spruce or travel through those little bogs. Another thing that we'll do is this would be a winter cut sale, so the ground is frozen. This does 2 things. It protects the ground, so you don't get rutting or soil compaction or a lot of ground disturbance. And also, when all the nutrients for the tree are basically dormant for the winter, that means basically the energy of that tree is stored down in the root system, and it'll sprout back much better than if it's used a lot of its energy to grow the leaves that you see in the summer. So there's a couple different advantages for a winter cut, especially in a sale like this. We won't cut everything. A lot of times people think a clear cut is just done specifically for greed to make as much money as you possibly can. That's not true. It's done mostly for sunlight purposes and certain other soil scarification properties. Basically, that provides a better seed bed. But we can leave some species, and we were planning to do so. So our wildlife biologist didn't want to see any of the basswood cut, which is fine. A lot of it's big and hollow, but it would make and is making good wildlife habitat. I think there's 39 some species of cavity nesting birds in Minnesota, and a number of mammals like fisher and martin and bobcats and porcupines will use hollow trees. So we won't cut any basswood. There's a little bit of red oak out there. We won't cut that because it'll live a little bit longer. There's spruce out there. I mentioned we wouldn't cut that. And then sugar maple also won't be cut because it's not that abundant out there, and it unlike red maple, which will only live to be 70, 80 years old, sugar maple can live to be 150 or 200 plus years old, and even longer on really good, rich sites. And also, we don't ever cut any dead trees if we can possibly help it. Standing dead trees also play an important role for cavity nesting birds and mammals, in addition to harboring all kinds of different fungus that may have different uses in the forest. And when those trees fall, they become even more useful to certain microbes, soil microbes, and fungi, and things like that. Where we can, we'll utilize the existing trails, so we won't build any new road infrastructure. If we do have to build any sort of access roads, they'll be temporary, and they'll typically grow in quickly. Again, it's a winter sale, so you don't have a lot of compaction, so the trails kind of tend to sort of disappear when vegetation starts growing back on them. But those trails could be repurposed and utilized if this area becomes a desired sugar bush area in the future. And future sugar bushers could use these trails as access trails in the future. And a timber sale, depending on the company, but a timber sale of this size could usually be started and finished within a few weeks. So it's not something that would necessarily drag out for years and years and years. It would probably just be a few weeks in the summer and then done. So after the timber harvest, what we would do is plant red oak, sugar maple, white pine, and white spruce. All told, we'd plant about 100 trees per acre to supplement what's already going to be growing out there, which will be aspen, birch, red maple, and anything else that grows better with more increased sunlight, and it's possible that they can escape deer, although we'll talk about that in a minute. If there's enough trees, sometimes the deer won't get all of them. And then here's an important thing. In 10 years after the sale, and we've done this on a number of other sites successfully, and it's something that we're pretty excited about doing. We've seen good results from some of the first projects we've done 10 years ago. You can go back into these sites and just really see that we've made a positive difference. So what we're going to do is in 10 years we could mark crop trees. These would be the trees that we really want to see grow well on this particular site. And we can have our resource management staff, that might be forestry, it might be our natural resource crews, it could be the day labor program, thin, dense sprouts, and cut away aspen so that desired trees grow faster and healthier. That would help you avoid that scenario where I showed you earlier where I had my hand extended out to a clump of trees that were 80 years old, and not one of them was big enough to tap. By intentionally thinning them, they'll grow larger faster, and they'll also be healthier because they'll have more sunlight, more nutrients, and more water to themselves, rather than trying to divvy it up among 9, 10, 12 competing stems that are all kind of just mediocre and barely living. And it helps them survive things like drought in the summer. When you have one tree that has more nutrients, that tree can survive some of those tough, late summer droughts or spring droughts more easily than something that's just really crowded. Getting you kind of like that garden picture again. Your carrots are going to be more resilient if you forget to water them for a couple weeks than if you just had a big crowd of them. So this is what it looks like. We do this on all of our timber sales when we're trying to protect deer from, or our seedlings rather, from deer. So it's basically, we use a couple different cages, but this one works well for us. It's essentially a nylon mesh cage. It allows airflow and sunlight in, but especially the main stem, the terminal leader as it's called, top stem, is inside that cage, and deer can't get to it, and snowshoe hares can't get to it, and red-backed bulls and things like that might chew on the bark can't get to it. And this is how you can get a tree to basically grow to the height of that cage, which I think this particular cage is 3 feet. We've used anywhere from 3 to 4 feet tall cages in the past. And that'll basically get them out of the immediate reach of some of the things that are trying to eat them. And you can see, if you look closely, there's some broken aspen stems. We can actually do that with saws and things like that, so that in this case, this is a white pine which is a favorite wintertime deer food for sure, and they do not tolerate browse well. They'll die if they're browsed. So what we can do is we can protect them from being eaten, and we can also cut the trees around them so that they get more sunlight. You can see the aspen is abundant, but there's just that one pine. That's the tree that we want to see grow there to be 120 feet tall for your great-grandkids and be 200, 300, 400 years old. And if we don't do that, there are no white pine out on this site, and there won't be any white pine on this site. We have to play an active role in reestablishing what used to be a much more abundant tree species in Minnesota in general. So after the trees outgrow the cage, and they're over 3 feet tall, they're still, think of a white-tailed deer, they can easily reach 5, 6, 7 feet tall when they get up on their back legs. So we need to start bud capping them. It is another way of basically keeping deer from eating that lead terminal bud, which is putting on the height growth for that tree. And it's just a piece of paper stapled onto that tip. You do this in the fall, and the paper will basically become waterlogged and soaked over the course of the winter and the spring, and sort of eventually dissolve and drop off the tree in early summer. And deer don't eat white pine in the summer. They prefer the other lush green vegetation. So they're really just eating these things in the winter. And so you can bud cap them. You can make sure that that tree keeps growing in height. And once that tree is about 6 or 7 feet tall, then you can stop, and you can finally walk away from that tree and know that it's probably going to live to be a very old, very large tree. It takes years of yearly effort to make sure that the trees that we plant or the trees that we want to see live actually live. It's a lot of tending. It's kind of nature's giant garden that we're working with, trying to make sure that there's a future for the forest for Fond du Lac, current Fond du Lacers, and future Fond du Lacers. And without those efforts, deer would be winning this. They'd be winning this war essentially, and Fond du Lac's future forests would have far fewer tree species than if we played the active hand that we have been playing in our forestry program for decades. I mentioned earlier that you can thin stump sprouts. Here's an example of a paper birch stump sprout. Let's see, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 or 9 stems coming out of this. Probably, in reality, only 2 or 3 of them would ever really live to be of a good size, to be drought resilient, and a little more disease or insect resistant. And so by picking basically the best 1, 2, 3, could even be 4 stems that you'd like to see, and you're going to basically pick the healthiest looking stems that are growing low to the ground, that look firmly anchored, stems that basically look like, with a little bit of TLC now, they could really become nice trees later. You pick out those stems and then you can cut the remainder. It's just like thinning that carrot patch. Instead of getting 8, 9, 10 little tiny carrots, this would basically assure that you can get a couple big ones. If you're a canoe maker or someone who makes birch bark crafts and you need bigger pieces of bark, this would be a technique that is going to get you that bigger bark and bigger bark faster. As you saw on the slide earlier in the presentation with the 80-year-old crowded trees, if that birch took that same path, you might have a birch tree there. You might have, well, in that case, 8, 9, 10 birch trees there. But none of them are very useful, and they're all very susceptible to any sort of environmental stress. This is a way of basically making them healthier and growing faster. You can do this by not only thinning the stems themselves, but also the encroaching aspen, which tends to be the fastest growing species. And so again, basically favoring the rare species that you'd like to see growing on the site over some of the species that will do fine on their own that are perfectly abundant, aspen being one of those species, especially on the site. And this same technique works for anything that stump sprouts. So I have paper birch and red maple written at the bottom of the slide. But basswood's another species that you could potentially do this to. Anything that stump sprouts, red oak, where you would like to basically see a couple nice looking, bigger, healthier, better surviving trees growing instead of just a big clump of small sort of stress trees. So in the long term, if we implemented this timber sale, we did our planting, we did our bud capping and tree caging and thinning, I think the red maple trees will be large enough to tap in about 40 years on this site. This is after the harvest, and I think the reason why they would grow large enough to tap in 40 years would be that we would actively be thinning them and cutting away the aspen competition and basically getting the desired trees, the maples, more sunlight and more resources. They could be tapped for 40 more years before they'd once again be 80 some years old and start to die off, just like occurring out there now. So you would have several generations of people that would be able to tap out the red maple trees on this site. And the sugar maple trees, recall that not only are there some sugar maples out there, but we would actually intentionally plant them. And again, they're a longer living tree species. Once they're large enough to tap, and that might be 40 or 50 years for the trees that we plant after the timber sale, but they'll be tappable for 100 or 200 years after this. If we don't have the sale and we don't do this kind of work, I don't think there's going to be enough sugar maple trees out there naturally that you would ever find it really worth your time to go out there and try to tap them. Again, paper birch can be peeled when it's large enough, the thinning, and of course that's going to depend on what your goal is, whether or not you just need a small piece of bark or a very large canoe-sized piece. But when they're large enough to suit your purpose, they can be peeled, of course, or obviously some people tap paper birch trees as well, so they'll be available to do that. And so essentially now, with the timber sale, with the planting, and with the tending that we've done over the years, the site now's got more and healthier sugar maple trees, paper birch, red maple, red oak, white pine, which is otherwise basically absent out there. More of all of that than it would have otherwise had. And a lot of people think like, oh, we don't have any old growth forests. It's all this young forest. This is a graph that shows in 10-year increments how many acres of each age class we have. So if you look at that very first kind of short bar on the left, what that is saying is that across all of our forest types, we have about 900 acres that are between 0 and 5 or so years old. And so what that is saying is that basically we've purchased, Fond du Lac has purchased land that has young trees on it within the last 0 to 5 years. Now, if you look in the middle of this graph, the highest chart, or the highest bar lines, you have an abundance of 60, especially 70 and 80 and 90-year-old trees. So we have this big bubble, and we have over 5,000 acres of 70-some-year-old trees. In fact, across all of our forest types, 85 is our average tree age. And if you think back historically, what that essentially means is most of our trees were quote-unquote born 85 years ago. And, so that would have been 1910s, 20s, 30s. And if you think about the history of the area, that makes sense. You have the 1918 fire, for example. All of our 100-year-old trees probably came after that, and our 90-year-old trees were probably coming in after that big 1918 fire, which burned so many acres of our forest down in the whole region, and obviously with a lot of casualties and things like that. So looking at just sugar maple and red maple on the next slide, you can see kind of the same pattern where most of our acres are in that 70, 80, 90 years old. Sugar maple's on the left, red maple's on the right, and we don't have a lot of young trees. Now I mentioned sugar maple will grow a long time, so it's a little less concerning that there's fewer young trees because these trees, sugar maples, can grow very old. But if you don't have a lot of acres of red maple, and most of your red maple is 60, 70, 80, 90 years old, as you can see, and red maple only live to be 70 or 80, that means we have, hundreds of acres that are basically going to be growing old and starting to die out, especially with red maple, just in the next 5, 10, 15 years, with not a lot of trees to replace it. And I've already explained sort of the tree biology of why red maple is not self-reproducing, needs full sunlight, and it really needs some protection from other tree competition and deer. Otherwise, in today's conditions, it just does not grow. It does not replace itself very well. That's not to say it's going to be gone by any stretch. There's always going to be red maple. In fact, the climate is changing probably in favor of it. But there's a lot of factors working against it as well. Things that we can't do anything about the climate, but we can certainly do other things to help these trees be more resilient in the face of climate change. So what are the implications of having a lot of old but not very many young trees? I already alluded to some of this, but over time, of course, will be less red maple of tappable size as the older trees die off. So we're going to have this lag time before these younger trees grow large enough to tap, especially if we don't actively do things to help them grow larger, and they sort of stagnate and get crowded and just never become very large trees despite their old age. Timber sales are a way that we can assure more acres of vineyard stands are available to replace older stands. And again, timber sales are functioning in place of the wildfires that used to grow, or the prescribed fires, the intentionally set fires. Timber sales are a way to basically replace that. It's hard to start fires now and let them burn like we used to 100 or 200 or 300 years ago, when there obviously weren't houses scattered throughout areas, and there was just many fewer people, and it was much easier basically to just kind of throw a match down on a windy day, burning in the right direction, and have a fire burn like you would want it to for whatever your intention was. And a lot of these fires then would have burned up some of these stands and basically hit the reset button on them. And that's how you would have this mix of old forests, young forests, and middle-aged forests, so that you sort of have a little bit of everything, kind of the children, the adults, and the elderly, rather than just elderly and few adults and few children. That's not sustainable, and in forestry that's not sustainable. Timber sales can help actively mitigate and make up for the lack of some of these natural processes. And of course, as I mentioned, A lot of this is not as dire with sugar maple because an 80-year-old sugar maple is not an old tree. That's not to say that all the sugar maple trees that are out on this particular site are healthy. They have a lot of frost cracks and things like that as well. And by having a timber sale that targets some of these disease trees too, you can get that disease out of there and make your new seedlings and saplings less likely to get that same fungal thing that'll hollow the tree out essentially and make it more prone to wind throw, breakage, or just being not very tappable or useful. So there's one thing I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation that this presentation is essentially specific to this timber sale, but it's kind of general to timber sales. And as a forester, regardless of the timber sale, I always ask things like, what's there? You know, what species are there? What condition are they in? How old are they? What size are they? You know, both height and diameter. What kind of plants are out there? What's the soil like? Are there insect or disease issues? Is there anything specific to wildlife that I'm viewing out there? All kinds of questions. Before you do anything, you have to know where you're starting with and essentially what's there and that you maybe want to promote and emphasize or preserve, and what's there that maybe you would like to see change, or diseases or things like that that maybe you would like to see out of that stand so that the trees or plants or wildlife, a forester gets to manipulate the environment in a number of ways, and it's not just about trees. There's so many things, ecologically speaking, that are obviously affected by what a forester does, and all those things have to be in your mind, maybe at the top of your mind while you're planning a timber sale, and what you want to do with it, how you want to design it, implement it, and what comes after. Then how does it fit in with what's around it? And this can be sort of at the large picture, where I looked at on that previous slide, you kind of look at what are the age of Fond du Lac forests in general. So how does this particular stand fit in with the general age structure? Do we have too many old stands and not enough young stands? How would we want to do that? Are all of our young stands in the southern part of the reservation and all our old stands in the northern part? That's not actually the case, but if you could ask yourself that and think, well, maybe we don't want all of our old forests in one spot and all of our young forests in another, for a variety of reasons, whether it's wildlife or just not putting all your sort of old eggs in one basket and your young eggs in another basket, and then have your old growth pockets wiped out by a big summer storm or something. Maybe best to scatter some of those eggs around, so to speak. And then at the smaller level, you might be looking at what's on the 40-acre parcel next door. Maybe you want to provide wildlife travel corridors, so something that you've got a certain wildlife species in mind, and they inhabit this area over here, and is your timber sale going to temporarily limit their access to cross it so that they can get to an area that they also want to go to? So, some wildlife doesn't like to go into openings. They only like, say, dense conifer cover. So maybe there's ways you can change the timber sale boundary or what you're cutting within a certain area to allow for some things like that. And you have to ask yourself, how does it fit into the past and the future? And this could be 100 years ago, it could be 500 years ago. And you could look into the future thinking, okay, my forest is aging and the climate's changing and we have some of these invasive species. So what are forests in general going to look like in Fond du Lac in 10 years, in 100 years, in 200 years? And is there something that we can do in forestry to either make our forests more resilient in the face of some of these environmental stressors like drought or invasive species, or more diverse, so that we don't have just a couple of species out there that might maybe be wiped out by the next invasive species? And basically, is there a way that we can make some of the trees that maybe used to be here more abundant? And is that even possible with some of the factors that are, staring at us in the future? You also have to ask what's possible on the site. So that's largely driven by soil factors, soil and water factors. So you can't grow For example, just like you wouldn't plant, a cactus in a swamp, there are certain trees that just don't grow well on certain sites. You get something like jack pine, which is a native pine species that grows very well on very dry soils. And if you were to plant it onto a really rich site, something that maybe sugar maple or yellow birch would grow well on, the jack pine probably wouldn't do well. Even if the tree itself did okay, it would just be so outgrown by the other trees that are more adapted to that site that it would do poorly. So you always have to look at what's possible, because you can't grow good trees on all sites. Some tree species, just because of their biology or because of their ecology and how they interact with their environment, are better. They grow better on some sites than others. So you always have to look at your particular site and think about what will grow well on the site. And then what resources do you have? I've mentioned that deer browse protection and bud capping is a yearly thing that we have to do on all of the sales that we're currently protecting trees on. Every year, year after year, it takes weeks in the fall to do this. Planting, we usually do in the spring, and it can take weeks to plant all the trees that we need to plant. And sometimes we have to look at how much work we're willing to take on based on how much work we're able to successfully complete. And so things like staff, how much equipment do you have, or what kinds of equipment do you have, how much time do you have? Maybe you don't have enough time. Just physically don't have enough time in the fall to get some of these projects done before winter comes and makes some of them more difficult or impossible. For example, you can't plant trees in the winter. They won't do well. You wouldn't be able to dig a hole because the ground's frozen. And of course, things always boil down to money. Fond du Lac Forestry cobbles together a whole bunch of different pools of money to achieve the work that we have achieved, and to help pay for equipment and things like tree seedlings and the cages that we put around them and the staff time to implement them, etc. And of course, you always have to ask, how does this meet the goals of, in our case, the Integrated Resource Management Plan, or it might be your Forest Management Plan. But typically, any type of management plan, resource management plan, is going to look at some of these things. What do we have? What's possible? What do we want to see? And usually there's a process of asking the public what they would like to see, what's important to them. That's usually documented in a management plan. And so anything that we're going to do, if it doesn't agree with the resource management plan, then it probably doesn't agree with, then either something changed or we're doing something different for a specific reason. But typically we're going to essentially stick to what we said we were going to in our management plan because it was a plan that made a lot of sense, and the public approved it, and maybe some other entities and overhead approved it. And so really it's sort of your guiding document. And as long as you stick to it, unless you have a specific reason not to, you're probably going to be pleasing more people and managing your resources better. And of course, this all comes down to, what do Fond du Lacers want, and how can we make that happen? If I worked anywhere else, I would say, what does the county want? What does the state of Minnesota want? What does the Forest Service want? What's the Nature Conservancy want? A forester is, if you're a private forester, what does the particular property owner want to see on the site? So foresters are always trying to please the people that they work for. It makes sense. And as a Fond du Lac forester, it's the same thing. What do Fond du Lacers value? And what do they want to see? And then as a forester, it's my job to basically say, yeah, we can make that happen on this site, maybe not this site, or no, red maple, we can't make red maple live 200 years old. It just doesn't live that long. It's the nature of the species. So it's my job to sort of to listen to what people want and try to make it happen, and try to explain or educate, and of course listen, and just basically figure out how can we make it happen. And maybe it's not possible everywhere, but it's certainly possible somewhere. And so yeah, my job would basically be to get the actual groundwork done and the planning done to help the groundwork be achieved successfully. There's another thing that we ask prior to every timber sale, and this is whether it's literally if it's a 2-acre timber sale or an 80-acre timber sale. We have to write up a detailed plan that states what's there, what our objectives are, how we're going to achieve our objectives, and what we'll do for follow-up. And we need to submit that plan for review by resource management staff. They have 30 days, so that's our wildlife and fisheries and wetland staff and our air program and our natural resource wild rice crew staff. We all look at it, and our cultural resource specialists will get that later. But everyone looks at it, has a chance to weigh in, and I'll tweak a timber sale plan based on valid feedback, so that basically you can know that any timber sale we do has been vetted by an entire office of resource management professionals. We also seek approval from the Conservation Committee. This is the on-reservation Conservation Committee because our timber sales take place on res, and it's a group of basically people that have an interest in the outdoors, typically hunters, fishers, gatherers, and we always try to make sure, and they're representatives for sort of that larger community at Fond du Lac, and so we always run our timber sales by the Conservation Committee and listen to their feedback. If it's an allotment sale, which recall that this particular timber sale is, in fact it's on 2 allotments, we always seek the approval of the majority of the allottees, and we would not proceed unless we had the majority consent to go ahead and proceed with what our plans are. We also need the approval of the RBC with a resolution of some sort. Before we do that, we need the approval of Fond du Lac's Tribal Historic Preservation Officer to ensure that there's no cultural resources that will be disturbed. Sometimes the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer will actually walk the site over to make sure that there's nothing out there that a timber sale would disturb. Again, when you have a wintertime sale, there's less ground disturbance, and so anything below the surface is generally not disturbed. So that's something that can be factored into too if you have, say, some artifacts 2 feet down that wouldn't be touched. But typically, our timber sales aren't taking place on top of heavily used historic areas. And if they were, we would probably just not have the timber sale there unless there was a specific reason why we think it would be a good idea. And we would change our boundaries or our plans to have no impact. Again, we need to seek the approval of the Fond du Lac wildlife biologist. I often will change or tweak my plans a little bit based on their feedback. And we also need the approval of the Bureau of Indian Affairs Minnesota Agency Forester, based out of Bemidji, the regional archaeologist, based in Bloomington, and the superintendent as well. So we need an awful lot of people, a lot of review process, a lot of signatures, some mini presentations or write-ups to basically try to seek consensus and approval of our timber sale. And along the way, we're adjusting accordingly. If anyone's got a particular concern or maybe a slightly different goal for a particular area, and if it's possible and if it makes sense, then we can basically tweak our timber sale to achieve their consent or to make them happy and appease them as well. And if it fits the overall picture, then all the better. And so since this is a recorded presentation, can't answer any questions obviously right now, but you do see my contact information. So you're always welcome to stop by my office. I'm up on the 2nd floor of the Fond du Lac Resource Management Building, located near the Tribal Center. Or you can call me, that's my direct office number, or you can email me. And I would be glad to answer any of your questions, or if you have a group that you would like to see me present this same thing to, I would be glad to do that as well. Or if you'd like to see sort of a shorter version or a longer version of this, I could probably make that happen too. So I hope this was informative and that you got something out of it, and I'd love to hear back from you about this timber sale.